everybody. My name is Patrick Kolbeck, and welcome to our first edition of the Mission Brief, featuring news by the numbers. What do we mean by news by the numbers? Well, most newscasts have an agenda. As a result, they select stories to fit the narrative of that agenda. We don't. How then do we select our stories? Well, quite simply, we do it by the numbers. What numbers are those, you might be asking? Well, that's where Nick Ruiz fits in. Nick is an expert in the field of data analytics. He has developed proprietary software that searches public data to highlight what topics are driving the culture in America. These topics are ranked by the numbers, and we use these rankings to drive the content of our weekly mission brief. Nick, why don't you tell folks a little bit about your system?
All right, well, first of all, we'll start at the very beginning. What we have here at Evolution is effectively a series of language or linguistic algorithms that pull from publicly available data, which means stuff that's posted on the internet, HTTP, be that in social media, be that in interactive forums, message boards, peer-to-peer media sites. That doesn't mean that we're looking through anybody's emails or text messages or anything intrusive like that. So what we're able to do is take widely available public data in targeted format, or in targeted fashion, I should say, feed that through our linguistic analysis system here. And what we're able to do is we're able to arrive at a very key and important metric when it comes to the news and really what's going to happen next. And that is something that we call language to action. How strong is the language in the digisphere, the internet, or the cybersphere, whatever you want to call it? How strong is that language, and how likely is that to result in visible action, be that in the streets of America or in political trends, or how likely is that to result in something tangible? So that's really what we're looking for here, and that's how we're really approaching this. Is we're looking for the most exciting and the most visible trends that you folks at home can really get ahead of using this technique and really start to understand the how, the what, the why, and more importantly, the what happens next.
Okay, so that LTA designation, when we put out all of our mission briefings, we're going to have a number next to it. That's what we mean by news by the numbers. And that LTA ranking is, I think for the stories we've got today, I mean, they're in the 6s and then also in the 3 area here. Maybe give people a little bit of insight what those numbers correlate to.
So in our in-office research, or for purpose of us cataloging and understanding the data that we're researching here, we use one variable. It's certainly not the only one, but it's one of the more important ones. And LTA literally stands for language to action, which means how strong, how frequent is the language that we're seeing, the usage of similar patternable language. How often are we seeing that? And how likely is that to result in something visible, a major news story, a major event happening as a result of the embryonic stage of that trend being discovered in the form of language? So we have a saying here, which is language is the smoking gun of action.
Yeah.
Right? So oftentimes you will see a trend develop, sometimes days, sometimes months, sometimes weeks, sometimes years, ahead of an action or a series of actions that follow a pattern. So that's what we're looking for. So when you see in our little graphic there, you see LTA, language to action. So for purposes of reference, we have 0 through 7. So we work on effectively a base 7 system for this, right? So what you'll end up seeing there is a 0 is completely neutral, inane, nothing, no pattern, no trend whatsoever.
Nothing to see here, officer, right?
Exactly. Move along, perfectly normal.
These aren't the droids you're looking for. Okay. Yeah.
Exactly right. So you can get up into the 2s and 3s. That's where we start to really take notice. And this wasn't always the case, but for more information on that, you can go watch our predictive analytics video, which we did, which is a long form explanation of what I'm trying to cram into 5 minutes here. So, but when you start getting up into 2s and 3s, now you're talking about a situation or a pattern of language. You're likely, not guaranteed, but you're very likely to get some sort of action out of it. Then you start getting up into the 4s, the 5s, into the 6s. Now you have a very high likelihood of being able to take patternable language and having that translate into something tangible that we see, action, if you will. Anything 6s and 7s, now we're getting up into what we call the volatile territory, and that's where you're all but guaranteed to see significant action, significant social change, significant trend, significant thought pattern, which ultimately, once again, leads to action.
Nick, your software has identified the following 3 topics that we as that citizens need to keep an eye on in the upcoming weeks. The first one that we have is around election. So election 2020, it says it's too close to call. On that scale of 0 to 7, this ranked as a 6.85. The second topic was early stage protest culture backlash, and that one posted up at around 6.5, so it's still way up there. And then the last item had to deal with the Second Amendment and firearms mandatory liability insurance as a topic that I haven't heard talked about a lot, but the linguistics are indicating this is something we need to keep an eye on. So I guess let's dig into each one of those topics one by one if we could, and kind of highlight first and foremost for that election integrity or election 2020. Why do you say it's too close to call, and what do we need to look out for?
Depending upon who has been doing the polling recently, we've seen anything, and this is just in public mainstream media, we've seen anything from, it's going to be a Biden landslide, it's going to be a Democrat blowout, all the way to the extreme opposite end of the spectrum saying, it's going to be an extreme Trump blowout. That's polling, and you of all people probably know that polling can be off by just a little bit. And in many instances, you can get those polls to say whatever it is that you'd like them to, depending upon how you want to skew the data and actually conduct that poll. So,
polls have become a form of marketing as much as monitoring or measuring.
There's a lot more marketing and a lot less metrics these days in polling. And I'm not picking on anybody in particular, but even the AP, Rasmussen, Gallup. I mean, you could run the list there, and you can get just about any poll at this point, depending upon how you conduct it, to say anything you really want. But when you go by the linguistics that are available, and we're talking, this is probably one of the biggest searches that we do in terms of size and scope of data, the data sources that we pull from. Our language right now, we're actually within our own margin of error here, not some random poll that was conducted, that shows some insane result, but we're actually within our own margin of error. So folks are often used to us being able to call elections weeks and months in advance, and we have a proven track record of being able to do that accurately. This is not one of those times. We are so close right now. If you look at the language that's available, and again, social media, peer-to-peer platforms and such, forums, message boards, bulletin boards, things like that. You look at the language, and there is such a clear divisive line, and the sample sets of both Republican and Democrat are so close, and they're so channeled and locked in their worldviews that going by historical numbers of voter turnout. Now, first of all, we forecast this is going to be a big one. Voter turnout is going to be big for this. It's going to be big, but it's going to be closer. That's really leaving this election, by what we're seeing, within the hands of the independent voter, well and truly. And the independent voter, slight edge to Trump on that one, which is kind of what notched it up even deeper into our own margin of error. But for those of you that are out there thinking that both sides have what I call wishful thinking. Oh, it's going to be a blue wave. Oh, it's going to be a red wave. Well, according to our data, even if we're off by a significant margin this time, it's still going to be really close. So it's something for folks to keep in mind, is the fact that a close election systemically is going to be very destructive here. Wow. Because we have two very opposed sides, diametrically opposed sides, that are just as far apart as they've ever been, perhaps, I dare say, since the Civil War. So do keep that in mind, and do be prepared for the ramifications of it.
Well, this underscores that, I mean, when we see all the different polling data that's out there, and we see how a lot of it's being used for marketing, et cetera, what you're doing with your predictive analytics is actually more important than ever to try to separate the wheat from the chaff. All right, I think we covered the election 2020, and we know that this is going to be a contentious election. But I'd like to dig into the next topic that we had on our top three list for this week, and that is the early stage protest culture backlash. Now, what exactly do you mean by backlash?
Well, we're starting to see the very embryonic stages of it now, where you don't actually need any special software or any linguistics analysis. You can just use the Mark I eyeball and the Mark II ear hole, and you could start to see the very embryonic stage of a fairly broad range center of society, moderate. First two standard deviations off of what folks would call center moderate, politically neutral, if you will, apolitical in some cases. We're starting to see the first sign of both corporate and social backlash against a lot of different groups, and it's not just on the left and it's not just on the right. It's
So
that there is a centrist movement in this country that's just about had it with both sides and the extremities of both sides.
So you're saying that the risk of getting fired from your job for being on one side of the political spectrum or the other is starting to decrease?
Believe it or not, that is true. Because a lot of these corporations, and when I'm not going to pick on one industry specifically, but these corporations are starting to figure out that trying to appease either of the extremes is a zero-sum game. It is an impossible task. And what they're starting to do now, especially, and I'm going to cite one group, which is BLM, burnt so much of their political capital following the events of George Floyd. They had an immense amount of support, and through actions of their own design, as well as others, managed to take that political capital and that support and literally just squander it to a point now where we have, in a linguistic sense, new demographics of people that normally would be sympathetic to those movements, or at the very least indifferent to those movements, starting to become hostile towards them. And it's the direct result of a number of things, but the one that I'd like to mention is what I call infrastructure disruption direct action, which is a real polite way of saying inconvenience protest, which means blocking roads, blocking trains, like the MAX trains in Seattle, for instance. These class warfare, classist-driven protest because we can kind of things has done more to damage the validity of that movement than anything has before. So we're starting to see groups that normally would be either sympathetic or sort of indifferent is the word that we're going to use, starting to go, guys, enough is enough. And as that starts to brew, we're starting to see that, manifest in corporate culture, where they're starting to figure out that the woke culture and trying to appease that and trying to contort and conform these big, massive companies to meet these demands is a literal zero-sum game. So are we there yet? Does that mean everybody's suddenly going to become a red, white, and blue flag-waving conservative? No, it doesn't. But what it does mean is that there's starting to be a backlash against both extreme left and extreme right, where they're just going, enough is enough, and we've had it. So that's something that we would advise people do keep an eye on, because that's going to kind of play into with the election, the process of, and the aftermath of.
Yeah, and I've already seen signs, visible signs, when now the NBA is finally talking about, after an abysmal rating season for the NBA Finals, they're actually talking about getting rid of their BLM placard or placards on the courts, which I know every time I was turning on the TV, watching different events, whenever I saw them pushing the BLM. I mean, one of my favorite TV shows, American Ninja Warriors, was pushing BLM. All the folks were wearing it on their jerseys and everything. And I'm telling you, they lost somebody watching it, because I know at the heart, this isn't about black lives. This is about Marxism, and I don't have any patience. So I'm one of those folks who's sick and tired of the cancel culture. Which, let's transition into the next topic here. We had the third topic was that of Second Amendment and firearms, mandatory liability insurance. And before we got on this broadcast, I was going off and I knew this was going to be one of our topics of discussion. And I was trying to find news stories and Google for news stories on this particular topic. And the most recent data I saw on it was around maybe 3 years ago. So help me understand how this is coming to the forefront as things that we need to be concerned about at this juncture.
Okay, so this is one we've been keeping an eye on now for coming up on 5 years. So the first time we ever saw data relating to the idea of gun owners, firearm owners, having to, rather than optionally having insurance, liability insurance on whatever weapons it is that they may own, we saw this 5 years ago. And then it sort of slipped back under the radar where folks stopped talking about it. And why we're seeing it now, and why it's at that sort of like 3 and change LTA level, is largely ahead of the election, because we all know that there will be action as a result of the election one way or the other, right? And that action oftentimes really unpleasant. Kyle Rittenhouse recently, right, in Kenosha, for example, that was a major step forward. So we look to, and now this is especially true if we see a Biden victory and there's violence as a result of that, right? We're going to see a push to ban certain weapons. They start with AR, they start with AK, they start with SK, right? We're going to start to see a push to ban that. The last line of defense that the NRA and a lot of pro-Second Amendment groups have is to throw their hands up and say, look, we'll make every gun owner carry mandatory liability insurance, and it's going to function very similar to the way auto insurance works, where certain things, specific weapons carry specific premiums based on whatever.
Can you imagine having no-fault gun owner insurance? I mean, come on.
It's not that far outside the realm of plausibility. And again, this one is that's why you see that 3 and change LTA number there. This one's real early stage. We haven't seen or heard from this trend in a long time. And all of a sudden, as this election starts to approach, we're seeing like, okay, look, there's a very high probability going by the 6 and change LTAs of those two other topics, right? There's a very good chance that in the event you add a catalyst to that, which there's guaranteed to be a catalyst, it's going to be one side or the other is going to win, right?
Yeah, there's
really
no doubt. Yeah, even if Google's not recognizing this as an issue, all it takes is going into the local firing line and gun range or trying to procure ammunition for your firearms to know that this is a topic that's on everybody's mind. Even my close family members here that never ever were concerned about firearms, all of a sudden they're concerned about firearms. So I can see how this is getting back into the mix again, even though when I Google for this information, I don't find that data. So this is a prime example of what it means for us to look at the news by the numbers. This isn't about going with the nightly broadcast and what they're telling us to go off and think about and talk about. We went off and let Nick do what Nick does and use his tool to go off and identify what is really being talked about in our society and what's going to impact your upcoming week and upcoming months and years. So thank you very much, Nick, for your briefing. And I want to let everybody know that if you're interested in additional data of this sort, please be sure to visit evolutionconsulting.world. Remember also to tune in to Let's Fix Stuff every Friday to get ahead of the news cycle and get your latest mission brief. Be sure to visit letsfixstuff.org for the latest news, data, humor, and solutions. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and be sure to check out all of our content at our Let's Fix Stuff YouTube channel. That channel features videos like our Meet the Rocket Scientist series that Nick's been a guest on a couple times. You want to know more about what he does, please investigate that. We have a lot of rational, data-driven solution podcasts there and a lot more. And if you'd like to support our work and get special access to what we refer to as classified data that nobody else has, please consider joining our Right Stuff Club for only 16 cents per day. Thank you again, everybody. Now let's go out there and let's fix stuff.